Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story comes to us thanks to subscriber Terry Baker, who shared an unusual letter with me. The account begins along the Cumberland River in Tennessee at Fort Donelson on February 16th, 1862. On this cold winter's day at the Dover Hotel, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of the Confederate Army commanded by Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner. A friend of Grant's from West Point, Buckner had only been the senior commander for a matter of hours. The previous evening, Buckner's superior officers, John B. Floyd and Gideon Pillow, acknowledged Buckner's view that the Confederate Army was exhausted and an attempt to break out of Grant's lines was unlikely to succeed. But Floyd and Pillow refused to capitulate and escaped, with some of their men and their reputation suffered for it. Buckner did go on to surrender about 15,000 men on February 16th. You students of the Civil War know that this is the famous unconditional surrender offered by Grant and accepted by Buckner. All of these men, these Confederates, were destined for prisoner of war camps at Camp Douglas in Chicago, Johnson's Island, and Camp Chase in Ohio, and elsewhere in the Union States. One of those prisoners of war is pictured here. He is 39-year-old Henry P. Pointer, the Virginia-born farmer described by one source as, quote, noble, generous, and an intellectual man. He was indeed one of those characters by whose life the world has been better. Another source described him as, quote, a high-toned gentleman, end quote. Pointer married and settled in Spring Hill, Tennessee, leaving his native Virginia about a decade or so before the war started. His wife, Martha Jane, died during their 5th year of marriage. He's pictured here as a civilian, and the style of his clothing suggests to me that he posed here before the war began. After the opening of hostilities, Pointer became captain and commander of Company E of the 3rd Tennessee Infantry, which was informally known as Clack's Regiment for its colonel, Calvin J. Clack. The 3rd Tennessee organized in May 1861, just a month after the bombardment of Fort Sumter broke open the war. The regiment's first major engagement was Fort Donelson. The regiment brought about 750 men and officers into the fight and suffered 88 casualties prior to the surrender. Pointer emerged without any physical wounds from the battle. Following the surrender by General Buckner, Pointer, the rest of the survivors in the 3rd, and all the other Confederate forces were marched off or transported to the varied northern prisoner of war camps. Many of the Confederates left their baggage behind. Pointer's captors transported him to Ohio, and after a brief delay at Columbus, he entered the officers' prison at Johnson's Island. Several months later, in August of 1862, he was officially exchanged and returned to the Confederate Army. At some point before August of 1863, Pointer joined the staff of Nathan Bedford Forrest as a lieutenant and aide de camp. According to Terry Baker, Pointer suffered wounds on several occasions, one of them near Memphis. Terry wrote, quote, he often negotiated under a flag of truce for the surrender of some of Forrest's opponents in the war, end quote. Pointer continued on and ended the war, being surrendered for a second time. On May 4th, 1865, General Richard Taylor surrendered the departments of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana. 5 days later, on May 9th, Forrest surrendered his command. Pointer made his way back home to Spring Hill in Tennessee and married a second time. He and his new wife, Sarah, brought a son into the world. Pointer supported them as a stockman and became involved in horses. Meanwhile, in the state of Illinois, another veteran melted back into society after the war. His name was William Wilson, and he had served as a lieutenant and adjutant in Colonel John W. Burge's Western Sharpshooters, later known as the 66th Illinois Infantry. Wilson had been at the surrender of Fort Donelson back in 1862 and picked up a war trophy after the Confederate surrender. This was a common practice among both Union and Confederate soldiers when they were on a battlefield after victory. In this case, Wilson happened to be walking by Pointer's abandoned tent when he found scattered papers. He picked up one of those papers, and it turned out to be Pointer's commission, his original commission from Tennessee Governor Isham Green Harris, naming him captain in the 3rd Tennessee Infantry in the Provisional Army of Tennessee. At some point, probably around 1884 or 1885, Pointer learned that Wilson had his commission. How Pointer learned about it is unclear. The likely scenario is that Wilson mentioned it in a newspaper article or a reunion, and word got to Pointer. The veterans back then talked. Word spread around, particularly when it came to objects that soldiers were seeking to return. And remember, we're now in the 1880s, 20 years after the war. The veterans are looking back on their service and those captured war trophies that they had. Some of them thought, well, I should try to get this back to the person to whom it rightfully belonged. And that's very likely what happened. What we do know is Pointer wrote a letter to Wilson after finding out about the commission. The whereabouts of that letter written by Pointer to Wilson are currently unknown, but Wilson's reply, dated March 1885, is, and here's what Lieutenant Wilson wrote to Captain Pointer. Captain Pointer, the letter begins, yours received this morning and was pleased to hear from you. I herewith enclose your commission. It has been a little over 24 years since you have seen it. Pause here because I think that might be a bit of a misunderstanding. It was actually 23 years, but let's continue. It has been a little over 24 years since you have seen it. I passed by your tent on the morning of the surrender, February 16th, 1862, and noticed some papers scattered around on the ground, and among them was your commission. That was all I secured. I noticed then in the tent a leather trunk, but I passed on and do not know of them since. I often think of that engagement and of the bad roads and weather. Never during the whole war did I suffer so much as there, and my experience was varied, I assure you, from there to Shiloh, Corinth, Iuka, Tuscumbia, Pulaski, Chattanooga, Atlanta, and through to the sea. We're all growing old together now. I would pleased to hear from you again. Yours respectfully, William Wilson, Lieutenant and Adjutant, 66th Illinois Volunteers. Whether or not the two men continued to correspond is unknown at this time. Pointer died in 1892 and Wilson in 1923. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.